Okay, hey everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to talk about introduction to winemaking just in general for VIDI 300. Yeah, let's just go ahead and get started. So it doesn't matter if you don't know anything about winemaking. We talked a little bit about it in last presentation, but this will be a little more organized preview of how wine is made, right? So first thing I want you to do is I'd really like you guys to click on this link and watch Introduction to Winemaking by the Guild of Psalms. It's a really good kind of documentary video that talks about the process, the decisions that need to be made, and you kind of see like the equipment in motion, which is going to be really helpful for your learning just to see visually, like what it looks like in this situation, right? Because I can tell you all about crushing, destemming, pressing, racking, but if you haven't been in the industry, that might just sound like really outlandish to you. It might be hard to imagine what's going on because you haven't seen it before, right? So please watch that video. It'll be very helpful for you guys. So after you watch that video, come back here and then we'll just talk about the process of how red, white, and rosé wines are made. So go ahead and watch that, and I will just continue on with this presentation, right? Okay, so part one, how red wine is made, right? So we have harvest, you pick the fruit, then we crush and destem it, then we go through fermentation, but this is technically known as like primary fermentation. It's the conversion of sugar to alcohol. After it's been completely fermented or fermented as desired, it goes into press. That will help remove all of the nicely new fermented wine from the skins. Then it goes through a secondary fermentation, also known as malolactic fermentation, which is a conversion of acids. We're going to talk all about this in the next couple slides, but it's kind of like a nice picture visual to see where we're going, right? So malolactic fermentation. After that is complete, it gets racked. So all of that newly fermented wine that's finished with the second fermentation, right, is pumped off of all the sediment, all the gunk, the yeast and bacteria that's left over. It's blended and put into barrels. It can mature in those barrels. Then it will be fined and filtered typically, but doesn't have to be, and then it will be bottled, right? So it just depends on the winery and what their practices are and the style they're trying to achieve. But that is the overall process of how red wine is made. Cool. So again, the steps: we have harvest, crush and destem, primary fermentation, press, secondary fermentation, rack, barrel age, blend, filter, and bottle, right? So it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work making wine in general, and it takes a long time too, right? It's not as quick of a turnover as like beer or even some other beverage industries, right? There's a lot that goes into it, and then also when you have a product that has to age for a certain amount of time, it just adds more overhead costs to your business, right? So step one, harvest, right? Grapes are picked at an ideal time. So depending on the style that you're trying to achieve, if it's a red wine, a white wine, a sparkling, dessert wine, and also the type of variety that you're working with, whether it's Cabernet Sauvignon, Sauvignon Blanc, Syrah, whatever, those are all going to be harvested at different times. We generally have a harvest season, which is like late August, early September through, it could be November for the Sierra Foothills. It's different depending on which region you're working with, but for the Sierra Foothills, that's our time frame for harvest. We have a very long harvest compared to other places, but yeah, it just depends, right? So you want to pick it, whatever you're working with, at the ideal time for the style and variety that you're working with. So what do we look at to determine when the ideal time to pick is? We have Brix, which is also known as sugar content. This will relate to how much alcohol your wine's going to have after fermentation, right? So if you have more sugar, you'll have more alcohol. Less sugar, less alcohol at the end of your fermentation, right? So that's going to impact your style. Acid content is very important, right? So the desired amount depends on the variety. It's an indication of ripeness as well. If you have really, really, really high acid, your grape might be having a hard time ripening, right? So you would see high acid and low sugar if that was that situation, right? pH. pH is very important because it will determine the health and stability of that fermentation and that wine. There's a desired range of pH where yeast and bacteria thrive and they can be healthy and happy. If you're outside of that range, the wrong types of yeast and bacteria can come into play, and then it can actually spoil your product. So that's not ideal. So pH is very important when we talk to health and stability of a wine and its fermentation, right? Also, a fun thing, that we have a chart here that shows the evolution of flavors in a grape depending on when you pick them as they're ripening, right? So if you pick them way too early, they're going to be very vegetal and taste like plant matter, right? That makes sense, right? If you've ever picked an apple off of a tree, or if you grow fruit or vegetables at home, if you harvest your fruit or veggies too early, it's going to taste like really like not a lot. It's going to be really like bitter, very vegetal. It's not going to be very tasty, right? So if you pick your grapes too early, you're going to have vegetation flavors. Then that kind of evolves into herbaceousness. So straw herb, still vegetal, tobacco. And then you just go generally into unripe fruit. So it could be green apple and citrus rind, but you're still not going to have a lot of sugar. Here you're going to have just like really, really high acid. Then we move into our fruits. So you have red fruit, then black fruit, and then jam finally. So depending on when you pick your grape varieties, that was the evolution of flavors that was seen specifically for Cabernet Sauvignon in this study, right? So depending on when they picked that cab, those were the flavors that were present. Cool. Okay, step 2. So once you harvested your grapes at the ideal time, it's time to crush and destem. And again, we're focusing on red wine right now, so the steps for red wine making. So for red wines, you crush and destem. You would take bins and then you would carefully pour them into an auger. This is kind of like a home winemaking crusher destemmer. In the industry, we have forklifts that lift massive macro bins that contain, up to 2,000 pounds of fruit at a time. And then they'll dump it into the crusher destemmer, and then it's a much larger process, right? But for home winemakers, it looks a lot like this. Very important to note that while we see hands up here, we do not put our hands in the auger while the crusher destemmer is in operation, right? Because we don't want anyone to lose their fingers. So what this device does is clusters are poured into the auger. It goes through this device where the grapes are separated from the stems. This is a destemming process. Stems are put into a waste container. You can kind of see them in the picture here on the ground. Some of them have fallen out the side. These are the stems. What's left are the grapes skins. The grape skins, juice, and seeds come through, and these grapes are crushed open. All the juice is pouring out. It's going into a bucket. That bucket will go into a larger container where they'll do a whole fermentation, right? So that's the process of the crusher destemmer. Maceration is a very important vocabulary word here. It's the practice of leaving skins in contact with the juice. So the color, tannin, and flavor can be extracted into the resulting product, right? Also, it is important to notice that the vocabulary word, what we call this product after the red grapes have been crushed and destemmed, is called must. This is now called must. Yeah. Okay, once you've crushed and destemmed, now we're on to primary fermentation. So you take that must and you add yeast to it. And this is going to convert all the sugar into alcohol. It'll also release carbon dioxide and heat in the process as well, right? So colors are extracted from the grape skins, the fruity flavors are starting to develop, tannins are being extracted, and it's becoming a young wine. It's in the process of becoming wine. Cool, so that's primary fermentation. During primary fermentation, so we call this step 3.5, we do things called pump overs or punch downs. So as it's fermenting, all of that carbon dioxide is pushing all of the skins to the top of the tank or vessel, whatever it's in, and it creates what's called a cap. This is great because it's showing you that your fermentation is active, right? You wouldn't be having any carbon dioxide if it wasn't fermenting. However, you're getting all those flavors and color from the skins. So what we want to do is we want to mix that tank either through pumping over or punching down to get the skins in contact with the juice again, so we can keep extracting more flavor and more aroma into that wine, right? So this gentleman up here in this top picture is doing what's called a pump over. So you can see his hose here. He just stuck it into the tank. Sometimes there's a valve you can put it into at the bottom, or like in the racking valves, like in the somewhat center of the tank, right? You can take the wine from the bottom of the tank that's fermenting and then pump it over the skins. So you re-wet those skins, mix that color, mix that flavor. There's a lot more other beneficial reasons to doing a pump over, but we talk about that more in the winemaking class. There's a lot of science behind that. But for what you need to know for this class is extracting flavor. A very similar thing is done called a punch down. So this is when we use a tool that has like a paddle at the end, and we just physically push the skins down through the cap, wet them, and reintroduce them. There's no pump needed. This can be done for large tanks as well as small vessels for fermentation. If you were to do it for a large tank, they would secure like a walking plank very safely that you would walk across and then punch down from there. So that's the difference between a pump over and a punch down. There has also been some I don't know if it's like a rumor. A lot of winemakers claim that punch downs create softer wines because it's more gentle process. You're not breaking the skins up as it goes through the pump, right? So that's something to think about as well. So that's what we do during a red wine fermentation. That can be done multiple times a day. I've worked at wineries that just do it once a day. I've worked at wineries that require me to do it 3 times a day. There's a lot of factors into how much you pump over. But again, we cover that more in the winemaking class, but it's still a very important part. Okay, next is pressing. So once all of that yeast once all of that yeast converts sugar into alcohol, all of your sugar into alcohol, then it's time to take that wine to the next step, right? So we have newly fermented wine. We drain that wine from the tank, and then we shovel out all those skins, and we load it into a press. This is a very old-fashioned basket press. It's very large, right? So all the skins that are shoveled out of the tank are inside of these wood planks. And then there's this massive flat piece of metal that will be pushed down, and it will squeeze out all the rest of that wine from those skins, right? And once that's done, the skins that are left over are actually called pumice. So we have must during fermentation, and then we have pumice after fermentation, right? And oftentimes that pumice is thrown out into the vineyard for compost. Some people do like rehydrate it and make piquette and other things, or grappa. There are a lot of other things that you can do with that, but that is what is happening at this point, right? Then once that's done, that newly fermented wine is taken down, taken to barrels or to another tank, and is prepared for its second fermentation. So there's 2 fermentations in red wine making, 99.9% of the time. So secondary fermentation is called malolactic fermentation. It's a conversion of acids. We do it for stability, but also for mouthfeel and health of the wine. It's a conversion of malic acid into lactic acid. So you can think about it like malic, mal meaning bad in Spanish, and then lactic, think of like lactose, yogurt, milk, right? It's much more creamier. So you have a bad acid, malic, and then lactic acid, creamy, and that's the conversion. And it also releases carbon dioxide in that process as well. Sometimes we do this process in barrel, but it can also be done in the tank. It just depends on the logistics and preference of the winery that you're working at. So if you would like to know, like specifically the conversion of acids and what is happening, we have the structure of malic acid, and that's what's present in like unripe green apples, right? So malic acid, and then we have the bacteria, our malolactic bacteria, converting malic into lactic acid, and carbon dioxide is released in this process. So this is actually not considered a fermentation. This is a deacidification reaction. It's taking this compound that has 2 acid groups, and it's cleaving off one of the ends and releasing carbon dioxide, and then creating an acid group with a compound with 1 acid group on the end, right? So that is the difference. And then the sensory effects are very different, and it's better for the wine all around. Cool. Okay. Malolactic fermentation. So we just discussed malolactic fermentation for red wines. There are certain situations where we take this practice and we use it in white wines too. It's a very specific style of white wine. So if you've ever had like a buttery Chardonnay, that is a classic example of a white wine that has been through malolactic fermentation, right? So if we don't take a white wine through fermentation, it will have more of those crisp, fruity citrus flavors and aromas and more acid. the wines that are put through malolactic fermentation that are white, right, have more of that buttery characteristics. Sometimes those wines go into oak barrels and they get the oak character as well. So it just depends. Okay, so back on our note of like where the red wine making process is. So at this point, we have harvested, crushed and destemmed. We've fermented, primary fermentation, then we pressed, then we racked, then we went through secondary fermentation, which we just talked about, that malolactic fermentation. So after that has been completed, then it's time to rack that wine out of the barrel or the tank, whatever vessel it's in, and it's time for aging and blending. So this purple stuff you see on the ground here, this is lees. So we had just pumped all of the wine out of these barrels, and then we were cleaning them out with a pressure washer and then dump them, and that goes into a drain where it gets pumped out into a wastewater treatment situation. But all of this lovely dark purple like gunk is lees. So it's leftover bacteria, yeast, sediment from fermentation. It's just part of the hygiene process. When we get into the winemaking class, we'll talk a lot about lees contact, sur lie, how some winemakers choose to keep their wine on the lees and they stir it, to enhance mouthfeel. That's a whole nother conversation, but that will be something that we'll talk about more in depth in the winemaking class. So if you know something about that and you're like, wait, that's not right, don't worry, that's just some more information that we need for this class. So racking, like I said, we take that clean wine product, pump it out of the vessel, and then clean all that sediment that's left behind. You can put it back in that barrel or whatever, and then it goes into an aging process. You could blend it with other wines at this point, and then eventually at some point down the road, whether your aging protocol is 12 months, 24 months, etc., then it will be bottled at that point. So that is the overall process for red wine making. I know that's a lot of information, so if you need to pause the video, replay it, or watch the video in the beginning again, you're welcome to do that. Okay, part 2, we're going to talk about how white and rosé wines are made. Not as many steps as red wine making in this one, but hopefully it'll be straightforward and will make sense to you, right? So whites and rosés are really fun wines to make because you don't have, it's a faster turnaround than reds. You can make a white wine and bottle it and sell it within the same year that it's harvested, ideally. We don't always do that because of inventory control or like wine club release requirements, but it just depends, again, what winery you're working with. But ultimately a much faster turnaround than red wines. So here's a nice picture from Wine Folly about how wine is made. So we'd harvest the grapes, right, at the ideal time. Then we would press them. So this is like a big cylinder that rotates, and it has an inflatable bag. Once it closes, seals all the way. There's a bag inside that inflates. It's called a pneumatic press. That bag inflates and it pushes the grape clusters up against the side and then like squeezes all the juice from the skins, right? So that's the press. Then it gets pressed into a tank where it gets settled. There's like a lot of sediment and like particulates from harvest, right? After it's settled, you could rack it or you could add yeast right away. So this is your primary fermentation, right? So yeast is converting sugar to alcohol again, right? Malolactic fermentation is optional. You don't have to, like we talked about, if you want that buttery flavored wine, you could take it through malolactic fermentation. Or if you just wanted a regular stainless steel, more citrus, acid-driven white wine, you do not take it through malolactic fermentation, right? Stirring on the lees, that's also like a malolactic fermentation like preference, right? So that will help the mouthfeel, will help the wine feel creamier. Once you do that, you can rack it. You can work on blending, clarifying it. I know, sorry, this like image is kind of all over the place. You can clarify it, which is where it settles out. You rack it out, then you can bottle it and then take it to the market, right? There's also some filtration and stuff that got missed in this write-up, but that's okay. It's still really good visual presentation of what's happening in the wine world. So a better title for this chart would be how white wines that go through secondary fermentation are made, right? So not all white wines go through all these processes. Okay, basic steps for white wine making, so I provided it for you for the reds. I wanted to provide it for the whites as well, is harvest, press, primary fermentation, rack. Then we have secondary fermentation only for buttery white wine styles or creamy, right? Rack that again. Barrel aging is optional. Most white wines are not barrel aged, but the ones that are through secondary fermentation typically involve an oak or a barrel of some kind. Then you could filter it, which is also optional, which is a whole nother conversation for the winemaking class. And then bottle, right? So those are the general steps for white winemaking. There's so many other steps, so many things you could do in winemaking, and that's what makes it like really cool and exciting, and one of the things I love about it. But sometimes when you're teaching this topic, it's just like overwhelming. It's too much information. So we're just going to keep it simple. Okay, now let's go into rosé. So now that you know how red and white wines are made, now we're going to tell you how rosé is made. Rosé is kind of a hybrid of the two, which kind of makes sense. But it's mostly in line with the white wine making, right? So you would harvest the grapes, and for rosé, it's typically a red grape variety or a variety with black skins, right? Tomato. So here in the picture, we have Syrah and Carignan as an example. Then you would take those grapes, harvest them, and then crush them. We want to crush them because we want some color extraction from the skins to give it that beautiful pink color, right? Once they're crushed, you could wait 2 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours. The longer that you wait, the more color and flavor extraction you get from the skins. So that's really a winemaker decision, a stylistic decision. So it just depends, right? So after your allotted time, then you would press. Once it's pressed, then you would start your fermentation, right? So we typically don't start you could start the fermentation here if you want, whatever. But we want to remove the skins at a set time, so that way we don't have too much color extraction, and then we work it just like a white wine from there. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, so there's actually 3 different ways rosé or blush wine can be made, right? So that first process we just talked about is the first way you could do it. So by using red grapes and leaving it on the skins for a short amount of time, that could be one way to make a rosé. An alternative method, which is totally legal and legitimate in the United States, is to take a white wine or a white juice of something that you just processed and add a small amount of red wine to give it a blush color. So you could make like a blend. That's an alternative method. And then the third way is saignée, which is the process of bleeding off juice from a tank of red must and just fermenting it separately. And that's actually different from option number 1, and I'll show you in this next slide. So for saignée, I'm just going to skip to this first. For saignée, what we're doing is so say you have Pinot Noir. Pinot Noir is a very light red grape variety. It is very delicate, right? So sometimes when we want to enhance the flavor of that wine, we adjust the skin to juice ratio, right? So if we have a tank of must that we just crushed and destemmed, you can actually drain off like 10% of that juice. Now you've increased the ratio of juice to skin, and you're still making a red wine in that tank. However, that small portion that you just drained off, you decide to ferment that and make that as a separate wine. So you make 2 wines out of this process, and then that becomes a rosé, a saignée specifically. And saignée means to bleed off. That's why it's that process, right? So here's a nice picture, right, of kind of what happens, right? So after, a short amount of time, drain it, ferment it, and then that becomes a rosé. And then we also have the red wine in the original tank. So here's kind of the slide that goes over what saignée is. So it's a removal of free run juice from a red must before fermentation. Like I said, it increases the skin to juice ratio. It can help against stuck fermentations. You don't need to worry about that. That's really more of a winemaking conversation, this part here. But something you do need to know is that when you remove that juice, it helps to enhance the color, tannin, pigment, and like total flavors, right? Again, sorry, this is like the slide from the winemaking class, so this is a little too much information. If you would like to know, 10 to 20% juice removal is very typical. And in this study, 20% was not considered better than 10% in red wines. But if you remove more than that, the wine becomes very difficult to ferment because you have a lot of solids and not a lot of liquid in there, right? But the very important thing to remember is that this process produces 2 wines. It helps you produce a red wine with more concentrated flavor and 1 rosé wine as a result. Cool. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, and then that takes us to our learning objectives to prepare you for the quiz. I will definitely mirror the quiz off of these. I'm doing a much better job of referencing just the slide for my questions. I just want you guys to know how to describe what wine is, how to articulate how the different wines are made. Any words in the presentation that were highlighted or bolded, you need to know those. Those are vocabulary words. And then also understand like the 2 different types of fermentations. There's primary and secondary fermentation, right? So it's going to be a very big topic of the quiz. But other than that, thank you guys for watching. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me as always. But I hope you guys have a wonderful rest of your weekend. And I look forward to seeing you virtually, I guess, next time.